You think you know what hunger is. When people talk about Rome, they usually picture marble columns of the forums, lavish villas, endless feasts under grapevine canopies. But the real Rome, the one that breathed with the weight of millions of bodies, knew only cold, cramped spaces, the sharp stench of poverty, and the dry taste of old bread on parched lips. It wasn't found on the hills or in the baths. It lived in alleyways and slums, in the stone boxes of multi-story insulae, apartment buildings where the walls were too thin to keep warmth in, but thick enough to muffle screams. There lived those nobody wanted, former slaves, migrants from the fringes of the empire, widows with children, jobless men. The shadow masses the empire tolerated but never acknowledged. Food rarely scented these homes, because the poor didn't have kitchens as we understand them. No ovens, just a hearth made from 3 stones and a handful of dry twigs gathered from an empty lot. There was no running water either. You had to go down to the street to find a fountain, if it was even working, and if someone else hadn't beaten you there. So cooking was stripped to the bare minimum. Boil a little water, toss in a handful of grain, if you had any, or steep mashed roots you'd ripped from the roadside. It wasn't cuisine. It was the art of not dying on an empty stomach. Nearly half the population of the late empire lived below the survival line, where life wasn't measured in years, but in meals. Not every date on the calendar meant there would be something to eat. The government distributed grain, known as the famous annona, but only to citizens, and only to those who had lined up before dawn. The lowest ranks ate when they could, and ate what they found. They didn't buy food. It didn't come from the market. It was scavenged, clawed from the earth, the trash, the corners of the city. Their diet was made of remnants, crumbs, rinds, pressed waste, peels, sometimes rotten fish doused in salt to mask the smell. Or more often, just broth with a root that looked edible but wasn't always safe. They learned to cook from nothing, not as an art, but because there was no other way. Even a simple bowl of pulse, barley porridge, took an exhausting chain of effort. Gather the grains, wash them, pick out stones, boil over a weak fire without spilling a single grain, and all that just for food that didn't fill, but merely delayed the hunger. Pulse became more than food. It became a symbol of survival. It was the first thing babies tasted when their mothers stopped breastfeeding, and the last thing elders swallowed before death, when they could no longer chew bread. It followed soldiers into battle, farmers into the fields, laborers onto construction sites, a warm, sticky mass that promised nothing but one more day. People tried to make it better. Added cumin, dried herbs, a drop of vinegar or cabbage broth. But usually, it was eaten plain. Just boiled grain with a trace of ash. Sometimes there weren't even grains left. They were replaced with husks, milling dust, or ground up dry leaves. The gut-wrenching pain of hunger became as familiar as breathing. It hit hardest at night when bodies cooled and food dissolved into nothing. That's when the fire inside began, what they called the feeling of your stomach twisting like someone had lit a flame within. People curled up, knees to chest, trying to stay warm and forget, but often woke in weakness or because someone had knocked away their last crust in sleep. For the poor, the market wasn't a place to buy. It was a hunting ground. They searched for fallen grains, crushed fruit, peels accidentally spilled from baskets. Sometimes vendors gave away what couldn't be sold, but more often they chased the poor away with sticks. Even so, they came back. Every sack, every crate, every heap of trash could hide a meal. It was degrading, filthy, dangerous, but the alternative was worse, an empty stomach and an empty day. Some stood outside shops where food was made for the rich, trying to guess what was sizzling from the smell. Others lined up outside public baths, hoping for scraps or cooled bones thrown out by servants. Occasionally, children managed to sneak near the amphorae where garum, a salty fish sauce, was stored, and lick the residue from the sides, risking a beating. But even a drop of that brine was like a delicacy to a starving mouth. This wasn't nourishment in any traditional sense. It was a survival ritual, a daily act not to die. Yet behind all the filth and pain burned a will, unshakable, raw, and naked, a will to live. It pushed people to boil dust, knead ash, fry spoiled meat, and believe that if they made it to morning, maybe something better could be found. They ate however they could, not because it tasted good, but because it was all they had left. But their main food couldn't even be called bread. In a world where everything had a price, and where life itself often cost less than a clay water jug, pulse was the exception. It wasn't bought. It was boiled when there was absolutely nothing left. It wasn't a luxury, nor an indulgence. It was the final line between existence and disappearance. And because of that, it carried more than just grain. It carried memory, warmth, and the Roman stubbornness with which the poor clung to survival. At first glance, pulse looked like nothing. Boiled barley porridge with no oil, no salt, no meat, made with cloudy water and a bitter aftertaste from firewood that hadn't burned clean. It had no shape, no color, no smell, and certainly no taste. But it had the greatest virtue of Roman poverty: accessibility. Barley cost less than wheat and was avoided by the wealthy, who considered it too rustic, too simple, too low status. Yet for the poor city dweller, barley was a treasure. It could grow even in poor soil. It stored well, and it needed almost no processing. Pulse was prepared in many ways, but the method was always the same. Pour the grain into boiling water and stir for a long time, until the kernels swelled, opened, and turned into a sticky, barely living mass that resembled glue or wet clay. In the countryside, it was sometimes cooked with vegetable broth or a piece of salted greens. But in the city, people usually made do with just water and a pinch of herbs, if any remained. Sometimes they'd add a bit of onion, or a stalk of dill, or rarely, a pinch of mint, which gave it a sweetish scent and masked the rancid taste if the porridge had been left too long. But pulse wasn't valued for its taste. It was valued because it was warm. In the cold stone rooms where the walls were damp and the windows were just holes without glass, a hot bowl of porridge became a tiny celebration. It was eaten slowly, not out of delicacy, but to stretch out the pleasure, not of flavor, but of feeling. Pulse warmed the belly, chased off weakness, gave the illusion of fullness, and offered at least an hour without having to think about what would replace it tomorrow. Its greatest power revealed itself in the early hours, before sunrise, when the streets were empty and every breath turned to mist. That's when a mother would place a clay pot over 3 stones, drop in a handful of grain, pour in what water she'd carried from the fountain the day before, and pray she had enough firewood left. She knew, if she could finish it in time, her children would step outside with something warm in their bellies, and that meant they could make it through the day without fainting or crying. But pulse wasn't just breakfast. It was lunch, dinner, snack, and medicine. If any was left, it stayed by the hearth and was thinned with water into a weak soup. Sometimes crumbs of stale bread were added, bits of dried vegetables, and on rare holidays, a sprinkle of cheese or a sliver of pork fat, though even that was more fantasy than fact. Still, every time a spoon was raised to the mouth, it carried not satisfaction, but hope. Hope not for fullness, but for continuation. Amazingly, archaeologists have found traces of pulse in the carbonized layers of ancient Roman kitchens. Chemical analysis revealed traces of wild herbs, wood ash, stone dust, and even insect chitin. That means even in food this basic, there was always something else mixed in, what we today would call inedible, but what back then was simply part of the norm. Dirt, dust, insects, whatever settled in the grain during storage, it wasn't thrown away. It was boiled. It was consumed. It became flesh. And in this, there was a certain philosophy. Pulse rejected nothing. It accepted everything, just as Rome's poor had to accept everything, because they couldn't afford the luxury of rejection. They ate what they had. They cooked what was left. They didn't divide food into clean and dirty, tasty and bland, because their only division was between what was edible and what was deadly. And yet, despite its squalor, pulse was more than just food. It was a symbol of resilience. It was the dish of the soldier, the laborer, the mother, the beggar. It was boiled in barracks, in huts among ruins. It required no gold, no cook, no recipe. It required only one thing: a will to survive. If porridge was the base, then bread was the meaning. It wasn't a side. It was the substance, the body of the meal, the thing that made eating real. A day without bread felt empty. A belly without it felt deceived. In Roman culture, bread wasn't just a food item. It was a symbol of order, a building block of the world, a marker of civilization itself. But for the poor, bread was never white. It was never soft. It was never fresh. It was dark, tough, and dusty. Not made from wheat, but from scraps. Not baked in ovens, but on embers. Not born of desire, but of desperation. Panis, as it was called, came in many shapes, but was almost always the same in essence. It contained more filler than grain: bran, straw, crushed shells, ground beans, millet, grasses, sometimes even clay. Anything that could be ground into flour was used. Stone mills didn't spare the grain. They crushed it along with dust and bits of stone. And those particles made it into the dough, turning every bite into something not only coarse, but dangerous. That's why the teeth of poor Romans wore down, not from age, but from bread that had to be gnawed like rock. The taste of panis was harsh, earthy, sometimes sour, especially if the dough sat too long. It went stale quickly, hardening into a slab that couldn't be chewed but had to be soaked in water or broth. Often, it was eaten with olive paste, the bitter byproduct of oil pressing, which only deepened the bread's acrid taste. Salt was a luxury, so the bread was nearly always bland. To make it remotely palatable, the poor rubbed the crust with garlic, or dipped it in vinegar water, just enough to make it slightly less dull, slightly more edible. An oven was an almost unreachable luxury for a poor Roman. Those living in insulae, crowded tenement buildings, had no ovens of their own. They baked over coals, directly in ashes, on street fires, or paid for access to public ovens. These ovens served dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. The owner would only allow use after baking bread for the wealthy. The leftover heat was barely enough to bake coarse dough, so the bread of the poor was often half raw, with a burned crust and a heavy, wet center. Sometimes they received stale bread from the market, not as a gift, but as a way for shopkeepers to get rid of old stock. This bread was often covered in mold, which they scraped off with a knife or burned over a fire, hoping the flames would kill whatever was dangerous. Some dried the slices into hard rusks that lasted longer, but more often they ate it as it was, chewing slowly, carefully, as long as their teeth would allow. For those who couldn't chew, especially children and the elderly, it was soaked until it turned to a mush, a near liquid paste. Panis didn't end hunger. It postponed it. It didn't give strength. It gave a pause. And still, it was precious, so much so that it was saved, hidden, divided crumb by crumb. Families stored crusts in cloth bags, tied shut and hung from the ceiling to keep away mice. Bread was brought home like a trophy. Sometimes children were given a piece as a reward for completing a chore. They'd eat it slowly, hiding it from others, feeling like they held power, not just food, in their hands. But bread carried danger too. In years of poor harvests, when a nona was delayed, flour was made from anything that resembled grain. Historians have found traces of flour made from oak bark, crushed seeds, even shredded cloth ground into fibrous dust. This kind of bread brought pain, constipation, poisoning. Sometimes it led to death. Not loud, not sudden, but quiet, drawn out, invisible. People didn't choke on the bread. They faded, lost color, slipped into silence, until someone came and took the pouch with their last crumbs. But the most frightening part of the bread wasn't what it contained. It was what no one knew. In years of famine, when grain was stored damp, mold grew. especially one type whose spores cause strange hallucinations, convulsions, and burning sensations in the limbs. This fungus, now known as ergot, poisoned the bread, turning it into a kind of madness. People ate it and began to see visions, speak in tongues, flee from shadows, burn their own hands, scream through the night. Some said it was divine punishment. Others thought a demon had entered the city. But the cause was ordinary. Bread baked from damp flour that had sat too long. It wasn't just individuals who suffered. Sometimes entire streets went mad, and still, they baked again. They ate again, because hunger was worse than hallucinations. They baked it in ash. They ate it with mold. When everything else disappeared, grain, bread, herbs, one smell remained. A smell every poor Roman knew, sharp, sticky, and bitter. The smell of the press, where oil ran from crushed pits, spent fruit, and bitter pulp. The oil flowed toward the wealthy, to shops, to villas, into amphorae. But the poor didn't wait for amphorae. They waited until the oil was drained dry. And then they took what was left. What had no name, only a texture. Pomace. Olive pomace was what began after oil ended. It was raw, soaked in bitterness, heavy with moisture and acid, smelling of mold, bark, pits, and soap. Nobody wanted it. Yet in that gray clump discarded by the wealthy as waste, the poor found a kind of strength, not nutritional but psychological. Because where food was absent, even scraps became the basis of a meal. This mass, sticky, damp, congealed, was collected in sacks or scraped from the stone walls of the presses, where it sometimes sat in layers for weeks. It couldn't be eaten raw. The acid stung the tongue. The weight twisted the stomach. So it was boiled over a weak fire in salted water with herbs. Sometimes garlic, if any remained from the last gathering. The result was a bitter, dark paste used for dipping bread or spreading onto crusts. Some grilled it over embers, turning it into a dense, flat cake, tasting and looking like soap. Sometimes it was dried, rolled into balls, placed on wooden boards and left in the sun. In the shade, it molded. In the sunlight, it simply hardened. The result was black discs kept as food reserves for the hardest days. They could be scraped onto porridge, dropped into broth, softened with water, or used as a fatty base. It wasn't food. It was a construction material of calories, with a taste beyond ordinary scales. Not sweet, not salty, not sour, not bitter, simply the flavor of survival. But this paste, this olive pomace, carried more than calories. It held remnants of fruit, enzymes, fat, and microbes born of poor storage. Sometimes it fermented like wine, sometimes it rotted like carrion. And still, it was eaten, because the alternative was not to eat at all. Families sometimes boiled it in water and added it to pulse to imitate the taste of oil, but the result was nausea, dizziness, weakness. So the pomace was set aside, left to rest, as people said, and tried again the next day, because even spoiled, it was the only thing that could be spread on bread when no fish, no cheese, no vegetables were left. Some of the poor worked at presses not for money, but for the right to take home the waste. They carried baskets full of warm mass, its sharp smell trailing behind them. On the way home, it dripped, leaving dark stains on the road. At home, it was divided into bowls and kept in clay jars, soaked in vinegar to slow decay. Sometimes, pieces of olive pits were hidden in it, sharp as glass. Sometimes, larvae. Sometimes, scraps of cloth used to wipe the press. And still, it was eaten, because there was no other fat, no oil, not even lard. Only this heavy shadow of oil, its ghost. Roman cuisine knew rich sauces, infused with spices, garlic, honey. But the poor had their own sauce, gray, heavy, reeking of decay. It didn't decorate the dish. It created it. And still, there were nights when even this pomace became a reason to smile, when it turned slightly sweet, or when a grain of salt was found in it, or when time had dulled its bitterness. Then they ate it slowly, with a smile, if only for one evening. But sometimes that mass brought something else, the scent of burning, a heaviness, blood in the mouth after eating. Then it was set aside, but never thrown away. Where meat ended, fish began. And where fish ended, there began what the poor ate. Scraps from fish markets, scraped bones, heads, guts, fins, tails. Everything that wasn't sold and never reached the tables of respectable citizens. From this, salty, rotten, and soaked in the taste of the sea, rose one of the pillars of the poor man's kitchen. Cheap fish, impossible not to smell from blocks away. By the markets near the Tiber, what remained of the day's catch was dumped into baskets. Fish without eyes, without skin, covered in dried slime, and a stench that made veins tighten. Merchants swatted them away like flies and sold them by the bucket for a copper coin, a coin the poor clutched like a life preserver. No one asked if the fish was fresh. Freshness didn't matter. What mattered was salt, the only thing that could hold off rot for another day or two. These remains weren't boiled or fried, they were fermented, thrown into clay pots, layered with salt, covered with a stone, and left in the sun for weeks, sometimes months. What emerged at the end was hard to call food. It was a thick, reeking liquid, dripping from lids, soaking into floors, seeping into walls. They called it liquamen. Garam's liquid brother, but far cruder, filthier, and deadlier. Garum was the sauce of patricians, made from clean fish organs, simmered with wine, herbs, vinegar. It was expensive, sealed in amphorae with cork stoppers. Liquamen was sold in broken bowls, in shells, in shards of pottery. It wasn't a seasoning, it was a substitute. It didn't add flavor. It created the illusion of food. Bread was dipped into a drop of this sludge. It was diluted in water, rubbed into pulse, stirred with beans. It scorched the tongue, provoked thirst, sometimes caused diarrhea, but gave a sense of fullness, and the poor returned to it again and again. Sometimes chunks were found in the mass. The brave ate them, cartilage, strips of skin, scraps of rib. It was rare protein, but dangerous. From this fish, the poor often developed inflamed gums, rotting teeth, flaking skin. Some grew sick, some died. But no one refused it, because the alternative was to go without. At first, children cried at the smell. Then they got used to it. Then they asked for more, because the body craved salt, fat, anything vaguely edible. Some families kept liquamen in the shade, under staircases, covered in rags, because the stench was unbearable. But it soaked into everything, clothing, hair, even skin. The streets where the poor lived smelled of fish even when there was no fish. They smelled of need. Sometimes flies came, sometimes maggots. Then it was thrown out, but only if there were too many. Otherwise, they ate it, scooping out the bugs with a spoon, pushing them to the edge. Sometimes they fought over whose broken bowl of leftovers belonged to whom, because there was still oil clinging to the sides, still moisture inside, still something left to scrape. But the worst part wasn't the smell, or the worms, or even the illness. The worst part was that the poor didn't notice the difference. They had nothing to compare it to. For them, the stench, the weight, the shadow of the sea had become familiar. They didn't know any other fish. They had never tasted another garum. They ate what even dogs wouldn't touch. And still, they survived. When there was no meat and fish was too expensive or too spoiled, the poor always had one faithful food left: beans. They were cheap, filling, and grew almost anywhere. Everyone ate them because the poor had no other source of protein. Without beans, many simply wouldn't have made it through to spring. Beans were boiled every day, thrown into water, set over the fire, and left until they turned soft. Sometimes dried herbs were added, or a bit of salt, if luck allowed. And if there was nothing at all, they were eaten plain, just boiled. The result was a thick, warm mash. Afterward, the stomach felt full, even if the actual amount of food had been small. Sometimes they were mashed into a paste, shaped into patties, or added to pulse. Leftovers were dried and stored. Beans didn't spoil easily, which made them the only food some households had, especially in winter when nothing else grew. But beans had their own quirk. They were hard to digest. People often suffered stomach pain after eating, bloating, cramps, weakness, especially if too many were eaten or they weren't fully cooked. People joked that after beans you could blow a horn like a musician, but most weren't laughing, especially not children or the elderly. Sometimes the beans were bad, stale, moldy, already sprouting in the sack. But throwing them out was unthinkable. They were washed, the dark spots cut away, left to dry in the sun. And then they were boiled anyway, because there was simply nothing else to eat. Street vendors sometimes sold hot bean stew. For a few coins, you could get a full bowl. People lined up. But if you ate it too quickly, especially on an empty stomach, it hit hard. Bloating, pain, dizziness. And still, people kept eating. Because a heavy stomach was better than an empty one. Pain from food was better than the pain of hunger. Sometimes fights broke out in poor neighborhoods over beans. Someone had stolen a handful from a stall. Someone hadn't shared. Sometimes the whole harvest was shipped into the city, and the outer districts were left with crumbs. That's when people poured into the streets, not for politics, for food. Once, real riots broke out over a sack of beans. Soldiers guarded the storehouse, but the people were furious, because they knew if they didn't take it now, their children would go hungry tomorrow. This wasn't about laws, it was about survival. When not a crumb of bread remained in the house, no handful of grain, not even a few dried beans. The poor went looking for food where no one usually looked, on the outskirts, along roadsides, in alleys, beside fences and overgrown slopes beyond the city. There, along dusty paths and near the walls of old buildings, grew countless plants that no one had sown, watered, or harvested. Yet they often became the last hope for a warm, simple meal. In spring, when the earth began to breathe and the nights grew softer, the first leaves of sorrel, wild dill, purslane, nettle, and other plants appeared in damp patches, plants known not from books but from sheer necessity. Poor families would leave at dawn with sacks and cloths, hoping to gather greens before the heat wilted them. They knew where edible leaves grew, where the greens were softer, less bitter, untouched by dust or horse hooves. Collected plants were rarely washed. Water had to be conserved, so excess soil was shaken or blown off. Greens weren't stored. They were eaten the same day, boiled in kettles, stewed with onion or garlic if any were on hand, sometimes mixed with porridge or flatbread. Often they were just boiled in water, without seasoning, resulting in a pale broth with a subtle herbal aroma, restrained in flavor but warm and nourishing. It wasn't a meal for pleasure, but to feel some strength in the body, at least until the next morning. Some plants were gathered not just for food, but for their usefulness. Leaves were pressed to bruises, brewed into teas, given to children with fevers. Knowledge passed down among elders. Which herbs to cook with, which to boil longer, and which to use only in small amounts. Mistakes happened, but people leaned on experience and caution, because to them, herbs weren't a random find, but a familiar, if humble, part of their kitchen. Even in cities where space for gathering was scarce, the poor found tiny scraps of ground, between walls, behind the baths, near streams. There they plucked greens, paying no mind to passers-by. It wasn't shameful. It was a craft, one on which dinner depended. And if the day was lucky, and the greens were tender, the food could even taste good, with a slight tang and the scent of fresh soil. Greens were dried on tile rooftops, ground into powder, and stored in cloth sacks, as seasoning for porridge or dough. Sometimes that was all that remained for winter. People saved even crumbs, even stems, and it didn't spark pity. On the contrary, it reflected resilience, the ability to make food from the plainest things without complaint, with quiet dignity. There were times when someone gathered the wrong plant or used too many bitter leaves, and the whole meal turned unpleasant. But it didn't drive them away. They simply chose differently next time. Gentler leaves, paler greens, safer herbs. And still, they returned to the same places, the same patches. Because once you'd made something edible there, you believed you could do it again. Sometimes passers-by were surprised to see women or children picking plants by the roadside. But to the foragers themselves, it was simple, necessary work. It wasn't a beggar's gesture. It was labor, calm, meticulous, and respected in a life shaped by poverty. One time, someone found a faded piece of cloth in the weeds, bleached by rain and sun. And still, as always, they gathered leaves nearby. Because food didn't wait for clean ground or perfect conditions. It was taken from wherever it grew. When everything in the house was gone, even the herbs, even the breadcrumbs, even the last bit of porridge, the poor would go where there was still at least a hope of food. These were places where people passed every day, the public baths, the noisy markets, the warm steps of temples. There, one could find what had fallen by accident, what was thrown away, what was half-eaten, what had been overlooked. It wasn't always pretty, it wasn't always tasty, but almost always, it was edible. At the baths, where city folk came to wash, crowds often gathered. People brought food, ate during breaks, and left scraps behind. The poor knew the best times to show up. They waited until someone left, then stepped closer. Sometimes there was half a flatbread left on a stone, a piece of fig, the rind of cheese. Even an olive pit was a find. They'd crack it open, extract the core, and chew it slowly, pulling out the last of the flavor. Temples drew the faithful, and there were often food offerings. Sometimes food was left at the altars, and the priests would hand the leftovers to the beggars. Sometimes things were simply forgotten. People didn't beg. They just sat nearby, quietly hoping. Even the smell of boiled grain or roasted bread was something. It reminded them that food existed, and if they were lucky, they might get close enough to taste it. The richest place was the market. Everything was sold there. Fruit, bread, cheese, fish, olives. But the poor didn't buy. They watched. Their goal wasn't the counter, but the ground in front of it. Crumbs gathered there, broken pieces, dropped fruit. People walked by, not noticing, while the poor scanned the floor. Sometimes they snatched something quickly, tucked it into a sleeve or under a coat. Sometimes they pretended to fix their shoes. It was like hunting, silent, fast, focused. The skilled ones could gather a small sack by day's end, bits of bread, a few fruits, even a thin slice of cheese if fortune favored them. At home, this became dinner for the whole family. The bread was soaked in water, soft fruits sliced, everything mixed together, sprinkled with dried herbs. It was a real feast, not in size, but in meaning. Food that wasn't stolen, chased off, or forbidden meant it had been earned honestly. Sometimes, kind merchants appeared. They would call the poor over and hand out old flatbreads, cracked jars of olives, the trimmed ends of cheese. People bowed in thanks and came back the next day, not demanding, just hoping. But there were others, those who shouted, who spat in their direction, who placed buckets of dirty water to drive them away. Then the poor would leave. They didn't argue. They kept searching. Sometimes children would run into a shop, grab a piece, and flee. To them, it wasn't theft. It was a game with life. If they were caught, they'd be punished. If not, they'd eat. Sometimes it worked. When there was nothing left, not even scraps, not even roadside greens, the poor of Rome turned to the simplest thing of all, grain. Sometimes it was found by chance, spilled from a cart, forgotten in a warehouse, clinging to the bottom of a sack, where only dust and husks remained. Even those grains were gathered, one by one, because from them a porridge could be made, not one that satisfied, but one that simply warmed. This porridge had no name. It wasn't part of recipes. It wasn't mentioned in books. It was made quietly, almost like a ritual. Water was poured into a clay pot, a handful of grain added, barley, millet, wheat. sometimes even seeds from wild plants. It was cooked slowly over low heat until the water turned cloudy, until the grains swelled. No salt was added, no oil. Only the slow thickening of the mixture was watched. It wasn't food. It was a pause between hungers. This porridge was eaten by the whole family from a single bowl, each person a spoonful. Sometimes only the liquid was drunk, with the thick part saved for the children. Sometimes it was spread on bread, if any was left. Sometimes a few leaves found that day were placed on top. When hot, it felt alive. Once cold, it turned to stone. But there was strength in it, not in calories, but in the way it kept people standing. Not for long, not well, but standing. In the heat, it soothed thirst. In the cold, it held off the chill. It could be cooked again and again, as long as there was something left in the grain. Leftovers were even dried to reheat the next day. Porridge made with water became the only food for 3 days, sometimes 5. Sometimes, instead of grain, people used ground seeds. Sometimes, crushed pomace. Sometimes, old flour from the previous spring. Anything that could swell in water became porridge. Even hay, even bark, if it was scorched and crushed. This food was humble, nearly transparent, but it was warm. And warm food isn't just food. It's peace. It's the chance to sit by a wall, exhale, let the body rest. Even if the stomach remained empty, the heart grew quiet. But there was a price for this porridge, not in coins, but in weakness. Afterward, the head would spin, the hands would shake, strength would fade. Children's limbs swelled, their skin dulled, and their eyes dulled with it. The elderly withered to bone, yet still they kept cooking, because there was nothing else. Sometimes dirt got into the porridge, sometimes ash, soot, sand. But it didn't matter. It was part of it. Water and grain, nothing more. And still, day after day, bowl after bowl, this porridge kept life going. When you look at ancient Rome from the distance of centuries, it's easy to picture the arches, the aqueducts, the marble statues, and the brilliance of the Forum, where voices rang out loud and proud. But if you go lower, to the streets, to the alleys, to the doorways without signs, you see something else. You see those who didn't speak, but stayed silent, who didn't build, but carried, who didn't sit at feasts, but waited for whatever might be left. You see the poor, for whom food wasn't a habit, it was a fight. Every piece of bread, every spoonful of porridge, every roadside leaf, none of it was just food. It was a weapon, not against hunger, but against vanishing. Because food meant a person still existed, still lived, still held on, still tried. Even if the meal was only water stirred with flour and the scent of smoke, it was a gesture, quiet, stubborn, defiant, that said, "I'm still here." There were no victories in that struggle, only delays. Delays of weakness, of sickness, of death. But from those delays, entire lives were built, modest, harsh, unseen. People tore leaves, boiled weeds, kneaded ash into dough, not because it was good, but because it meant something. In every cooked grain, in every soaked crust, in every mouthful of broth was the memory of how to keep a body warm when everything else was cold. These meals had no names. They weren't placed on fine tables or written into recipes, but they fed. They fed a city that lived on the divide between wealth and endurance. Rome stood not only on columns, but on pulse. Not only on wine, but on beans. Not only on Senate speeches, but on bread baked in ashes. Women knew how to make dinner from 3 grains. The elderly carried in memory flavors that no longer existed. Children learned where the soft greens grew. This was a kind of wisdom not passed through words, but through the smell of steam, the sound of boiling water, the scrape of a spoon against a clay bowl. And still, despite poverty, hunger, damp, and exhaustion, people kept cooking. They kept searching, gathering, stirring, boiling. Because food, even the simplest food, is connection. A link to yesterday, to tomorrow morning, to others who share the same pot. It's not just sustenance, It's the language hope speaks in. You may think this is all in the past, that things are different now. But in every bite of bread you eat without a second thought, there is a shadow of someone who once ate it shivering in Rome, 2,000 years ago. And without knowing it, you continue that circle, because our entire history is the history of how we ate and of what let us stay. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.